And even what's interesting is even the Hindu communities in South India have traditions about St. Thomas, which is
Really?
very interesting. So when people talk about this and debate, well, did Thomas actually come there? It wouldn't make sense that the Hindus would also have traditions about him. You might be able to argue, oh, they added it in later because it was such a big, I don't know. But anyway, I think the evidence is fairly strong. But even if you don't think St. Thomas the Apostle came to India, the Christian presence is historically fairly well documented from the first millennium onward, as well as its relationship with the Church of the East Syriac Church. And so Syriac actually has been a part of the South Indian Christian community longer than the vernacular language, which is called Malayalam now, which kind of emerged in the 10th century, I believe. So it's interesting that Syriac is such a big part of the identity there.
Hello, everyone. I'm excited to welcome to today Pradeep Alexander Hatcher. And you are a deacon in the Syriac Church from India, correct? The Malankaran Church?
Correct, yeah. So the official title, just to confuse people even more, is the Malankara Orthodox Syrian Church, the Orthodox Church in India. And we'll talk about why the word Syrian is in there and why it's not Syriac, among other things. But yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks so much, Matthew, for having me.
Yeah, for sure. So why is that? Why is it Syrian and not Syriac?
So it goes to the history of the Orthodox Church in India, and this will be helpful for when we talk about the liturgical music. So, as tradition holds, St. Thomas the Apostle came to India around 52 AD, and since that time, there's been a Christian community in the south of India where he landed, which is the southwest coast, which was called the Malabar Coast.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's referred to as the state of Kerala in India. And Malankara is also an older name or a name for that region. It's very mountainous and it refers to the mountains and the sea, Malankara. So basically, from the time that, or shortly after, you could say St. Thomas came there, and some scholars dispute whether St. Thomas actually came there, but the historical evidence is very strong that there was a Christian community in the south of India from at least the second century onward. They have pretty good textual sources. And because I think of its distance from the rest of the Christian world at that time, the Near East and so forth, and North Africa and Europe, I think it was just a natural association that the closest church to the Indian Christian community was kind of the Persian church, or you could say the East Syriac Church, Syriac being a dialect of Aramaic, the language our Lord and the Apostles spoke. Syriac is the Aramaic dialect from Edessa, which is now in modern Turkey,
Mm-hmm.
modern day Turkey. And the Aramaic Syriac spoken in the eastern regions of the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, that area, Persia, was referred to as East Syriac, just a different kind of dialect of Syriac. And there's a West Syriac, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. But from very early in the first millennium, there was a relationship that became established between the community, the Christian community in South India, and the Persian church, which is now the Church of the East, or the East Syriac Church.
Which is
So,
different than Syrian Church of the East, right?
well, it is basically that is the church that became the Church of the East, the Assyrian Church. So, um, what happened was the bishops from that region of the Middle East kind of oversaw the church in India, and from a very early date, the Christians in India began using Syriac tradition, the East Syriac, which was, of course, known as the Nestorian church after Christological controversies in the fourth century. And but that being the case, basically the Syriac culture and heritage, and there were groups of immigrants from the Middle East who came during various persecutions to South India. The reason why St. Thomas likely landed there in the first place was because it was a port, and it was a very busy port, and merchants had access to it. And the Rajas, the kings of that particular part of India, were historically very tolerant. And so St. Thomas wasn't martyred until he went outside of that region and to the state next door, which is now called Tamil Nadu. And even what's interesting is even the Hindu communities in South India have traditions about St. Thomas, which is
Really?
very interesting. So when people talk about this and debate, well, did Thomas actually come there? It wouldn't make sense that the Hindus would also have traditions about him. You might be able to argue, oh, they added it in later because it was such a big, I don't know. But anyway, I think the evidence is fairly strong. But even if you don't think St. Thomas the Apostle came to India, the Christian presence is historically fairly well documented from the first millennium onward, as well as its relationship with the Church of the East Syriac Church. So Syriac actually has been a part of the South Indian Christian community longer than the vernacular language, which is called Malayalam now, which kind of emerged in the 10th century, I believe. So it's interesting that Syriac is such a big part of the identity there. So historically, people in the southern state of Kerala, that community where the church kind of grew and was founded, were called Syrian Christians because 50, 60 years ago, sometimes to refer to the Syriac language, they would say Syrian or the Syrian people, not referring to the polity or the country of Syria, but to the Aramaic Syriac language. And so India were called Syrian Christians or Suryanis, or even referred to as Nasranis, which means Nazarenes. So we're kind of a really particular,
like in Iraq, right? Mm-hmm. How like under the ISIS persecution, they had,
yes,
they put the Arabic in
for the yeah, exactly,
for Nazarene. So it's the same in India.
Same in India because we were historically, that as an ancient community, and because its association with the Syriac culture and language in the Middle East, they were referred to as that. And that state in India is really interesting relative to the rest of India. It was generally peaceful, and up until recently, the population was divided evenly among Hindus, Christians, and Muslims. It's like 33 point whatever, 33 point whatever, 33 point whatever. And so it's a really fascinating place. And even other Indians from the north, growing up, when I'd meet someone from North India, for example, they had no idea who we were. They thought the Christians in India are because of the English or because of the Portuguese. And interestingly enough, when the Portuguese landed in South India in the 1498 is when they first landed there. Vasco da Gama was the first, I think, to land there. They were shocked that they were Christians there. They had no idea. So
wow.
you can kind of get a sense of how isolated that community was for so many centuries of Christian history. There is some evidence that maybe a bishop, or at least a bishop who was in charge of the Indian church, was at the Council of Nicaea, because there's someone who has been listed as a bishop of Persia and India. But some scholars had said, oh, maybe that's a later interpolation just to show how universal the Council of Nicaea was, because how could bishops from Persia have attended that council within the Byzantine Empire? So whatever the case may be, the Indian church was there with this East Syriac connection to the Church of the East, the Persian Christian church. When the Portuguese got there, again, they were shocked that there were Christians there, And they started to pick up that, okay, this community is associated with the Nestorian Church, the Church of the East. And so the Jesuits who had come there, they actually brought the Inquisition to South India, not only to Kerala, but the state above Goa. And so it was not a very peaceful period. And, a lot of Indian Christians don't have, obviously, very kind sentiment toward like Francis Xavier, who was a saint in the Roman Catholic tradition, but played a big role in bringing the Inquisition to India, and the Jesuits. And so they burned a lot of the church documents and the prayer books and the services because they were trying to root out this Nestorian connection that they perceived there, and they wanted to bring them under Rome and using the Latin Rite.
But now your church isn't Nestorian, right?
No, so that's where it gets really complicated. So, because of the unrest that the Portuguese were causing among the Christian community in India, a group of leaders came together and they took an oath, and this is called the Kunan cross oath, or the oath taken at a place called Kunan, and there's a cross still there that commemorates this event. And they came together and they said, we're not going to come under Rome. We want to maintain the faith of our forefathers. And so then what happened was they started writing letters to various Orthodox patriarchates. So they wrote to the Greek Church, they wrote to the Syriac Church of Antioch, the Syriac Orthodox, or the West Syriac Church based in Antioch, which is that, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, and so forth.
Oriental Orthodox, meaning
yes.
not Byzantine, Chalcedonian, the non-Chalcedonian, but they reached out to all of them.
Non-Chalcedonian Church of Antioch, the Oriental Orthodox Church, but they also reached out to the Greek Church, right? So, and I believe there was others they reached out to. And the Syriac Church of Antioch, the patriarch, responded and said, yes, we'll send bishops, we'll help you. And so I think in India, they didn't have a conception that there was, again, it was really isolated community. I don't think they had much of a conception of the difference between, for example, the Church of the East and the West Syriac Church, the Oriental, versus the Nestorian Church, or the church that's been at least labeled Nestorian. So a group went under the Syriac Church of Antioch, and oddly enough, the majority of the community represented by that oath, that Kunan cross oath, they actually went back to they did come under the Roman Catholic Church because the Pope had realized that the Jesuits from Portugal were being a little bit heavy-handed in India, and so I think he had then kind of pacified the situation. And so a lot of the community remained under, or did come under Rome, and they were allowed to kind of keep the East Syriac Rite. So today, India is very complicated. So in Kerala, you have the group that became Oriental Orthodox under the West Syriac Patriarch of Antioch.
Even though their rites are East Syriac.
Well, we have West Syriac right now, but we actually had or even the Orthodox Church, the Oriental Orthodox community, kept East Syriac rites until like the end of the 19th century, and then it was kind of West Syriacicized fully after that point. But the largest group of that Suryani Nasrani community actually is East Syriac Catholic. So they're known as Syro-Malabars, Syriac Syro-Malabar, name of that coast. And they have kind of a blend of Latin and East Syriac Rite. It's a really interesting kind of mix of the two. So it's not purely East Syriac Rite. So there was the Syriac, East Syriac Rite Catholics, and then the West Syriac Rite Oriental Orthodox. And then there are Latin Rite Catholics there as well. And then once the English came in, and the Dutch presence was there as well, and then later missionaries from Europe. So now you also have Protestants of various denominations from that community. You even have, really interesting, a West Syriac Rite Anglican church that is low church theology but high church liturgy. It's a really fascinating group called the Marthomas. And their name even is confusing.
What's it called?
The
I gotta write this down.
Marthoma, and Marthoma just means St. Thomas. So they're the St. Thomas Church, but they reject the intercession of saints and prayers for the dead and so forth. But their name is St. Thomas. So you're like, wait. But even the Protestants from Kerala, from South India, have this strong attachment to St. Thomas and the tradition that he founded our community. So interestingly enough, some of the Protestants, there's even an evangelical church that calls themselves St. Thomas Evangelical Christian, the St. Thomas Evangelical Church. So it's a really fascinating history, and now it's just a jumble of denominations. But the majority of those indigenous Christians from that community are the Syro-Malabar Eastern Rite Catholics with the East Syriac Latin blend liturgically, and then you have the Orthodox, and the Orthodox sadly are divided into two jurisdictions, one directly under the Syriac Patriarch of Antioch, and then another that is governed, as Autocephalus is governed by a synod in India, the Catholicos Patriarch in India.
And they're both Oriental Orthodox.
Both Oriental Orthodox, both a member of the Oriental family. But sadly, there's a lot of tension between those two groups because they're still fighting over, jurisdictional matters, which, as my dad says, my dad's a priest in the Orthodox Church. He said the Achilles heel of Orthodoxy is jurisdictional disputes. So we share the same faith everywhere, but we can't resolve simple disputes over, who should have, authority over this church or that church. You would think someone would be humble enough, right? You would think to say, you go ahead. Like, as long as we're at peace, it's the same faith. Jurisdiction doesn't matter, but that's where we are. So in India, sadly, the Orthodox Church is kind of divided into two factions. But both
now,
share
what
the same
about
faith, same tradition.
Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. What about
No worries.
Eastern Orthodox, the Byzantine? Is there a St. Thomas Eastern Orthodox in India?
No,
and also a Syrian Church of the East. Is there still a contingent of legit Nestorian East Syriac? And after you answer that question, maybe I should go back for everyone who's confused about what we're talking about, and then try to wrap up with a little bit of the, the history behind what we're talking about.
Right. So yes, there is actually a church that is attached not to Rome, but to the Church of the East, and to the Syrian Church of the East, but they came under them after that split with the Portuguese too. So the reason why that's important is because it's hard to say. Unfortunately, we don't have a clear picture of what the indigenous Christian community looked like and how they practiced their liturgical rites. Were they just purely East Syriac rite for centuries and centuries, or did they kind of have an Indianized Christianity? It's kind of a black hole before the 16th century, partly because the Portuguese burned everything, so there's not much evidence for anything else, and there's not really not the evidence out there historically. It's a hot, humid place. Things disintegrate, so there's not a lot of things that exist that can give us a clear picture of what we were like. So the Church of the East churches that are not under Rome, that are in Kerala, they came back into contact with the Church of the East at a later date. And so it's not clear, we can't use them. It would be nice, but we can't use them to say, like, okay, well, they have exactly the tradition that we had before the Portuguese landed in India. We just don't know. But yes, they would be under the Church of the East, which is, which is described as Nestorian. So
there is a East Syriac rite under the Assyrian Church of the East that is Nestorian, yes, that you could look at and say, this may or may not be more of what the East Syriac rite was before we moved to West Syriac rite, but you can't be for sure because of, just the vagaries of history.
Exactly. So, even for the West Syriac rite, right, the Oriental Orthodox Church in Kerala, which is where the church that I'm from, they were kind of taught by bishops and priests and so forth who came from the Middle East as we were getting established, and teaching us and helping us get organized. And even then we still kept a lot of I think all the sacramental services, like other than the divine liturgy, the sacraments, baptism and stuff, were done according to the East Syriac rite, if I remember correctly, up until, the end of the 19th century. And then it was kind of West Syriacicized uh, following that. And then again, one of the patriarchs of Antioch, Jacob the Third or Jacob the Third, came to India in the middle of the 20th century and taught um, specifically the music. He was a liturgical music master. Um, and so it's sort of even further it's sort of been, West Syriacicized at different points, including recently. And the faction in India currently that is governed directly by the Patriarch of Antioch and the Synod in the Middle East, they really hold very closely to what the Middle Easterners are doing. And so it's kind of that influence is still really strong. Whereas the autocephalous faction, it still does maintain that tie. And our rites are identical and the music is identical. But I'm sure at a certain point, if we don't get back together, it may sort of kind of depart from one another in a small way in terms of like the liturgical rites, maybe some of the liturgical music, just because the autocephalous church is less concerned with maybe how the church in the Middle East, Syriac church in the Middle East, is doing things as far as the music or liturgically. But that heritage is still really strong, and even the autocephalous church in India lists the Patriarch of Antioch as the spiritual head of the church. So that tie to the Syriac tradition is still very strong and very cherished and valued, even though we're at odds administratively right now.
Now, what about the Eastern Orthodox, the Byzantine or Russian or?
So there was no historical Eastern Orthodox community in India, but now the Russians in particular have been doing some great evangelistic work in North India, and so there are communities now in Pakistan and other areas of North India. So there are now communities within the last half century, I would say, that are Eastern Orthodox, primarily Russian Orthodox. So that's one of the failures of the Orthodox community in India, of the Christian community in India, is that we really stayed in the southwest corner. My Indian grandfather, sad Irish grandparents and Indian grandparents, he used to say, if we just would have crawled on our knees, we could have made all of India, Christian, could have made them Orthodox. But we sort of stayed back in our shell. Some of that was due to fear of persecution if we left. But I think also there's, we also have to answer for the fact that we just weren't interested in evangelizing the way that we should have all these centuries and centuries, right? 2 millennia of Christianity in India. Now there are more and more efforts, and there were Christian communities in Sri Lanka at one point, and in Goa, the state north of Kerala, where there's now a big Latin Catholic community there, and various.
The Syrian Church of the East went all the way into China.
Yep. So those missionaries went so far, and there is a tradition. Eusebius and another historical source reference this, but a Gospel of Matthew that was written in Hebrew was found in North India. So it didn't have any attachment to the community in South India, founded by St. Thomas. It no longer exists, but there's this record of, okay, this was found. And so there was some kind of Christian presence in the north of India, even in the first millennium. But unfortunately, it's such a mystery because, good records weren't kept and so forth. So, even you would think there would be a memory of saints of the pre-Portuguese existence of the church, pre-contact with the Portuguese, but there really isn't. There's a few East Syriac saints that we commemorate that were from the period before them. But where are the indigenous saints and holy people and martyrs? At one point, Timur-Lin, the Muslim conqueror, came through and beheaded priests at the altar and things like that. But we don't have really, I guess we just don't have a sense of what we were like or where are our holy people. Maybe in some small villages and some families, they keep records of, okay, well, this was a saint from our family, but it's not really recognized by the wider church or the wider community. So, which is unfortunate, but it kind of is what it is. So, the Oriental Orthodox Church in India really, it's West Syriac, so it's not really Um, it does have influences from, kind of Indian culture and Malayali culture, um, but less than you might think. It's really a West Syriac tradition, West Syriac church.
Okay. So, just for the sake of anyone who's totally confused now, 24 minutes in, what are you talking about? Correct me if I'm wrong, but let me try to give the short spiel, right? So, the church was the church was relatively undivided, right? Until I will correct myself as we go along. So, it was relatively undivided until the Great Schism, where East and West splits. But there was a big schism before that, and the big schism before that was in 450 at the Council of Chalcedon, where certain Christian groups broke off over a Christological controversy, and then that has what you now call the Oriental Orthodox versus the Eastern Orthodox. So near 1000, we have the split between, Byzantium and the West. But in 450, we have the split between the Oriental and the Eastern, which is where we now have Syriac, the Syriac Orthodox, the Coptic Orthodox, Ethiopian, Eritrean, Armenian. All of those are Oriental Orthodox, whereas Greek and Russian Orthodox are all Eastern Orthodox, as they're called today. But there was also technically another split before the 450 split, which is when a group of Assyrians were Nestorian church, and they sort of split off, and but they were also the biggest missionary church in history, and so even though now they're pretty much tiny, and there's a few of them that have been absorbed into the Catholic Church, especially in Iraq, and as you're now telling me, also in India, that they also were not in communion with anyone else at the time, because their Christological controversy as well, which had to do with and Nestorianism has to do with the two natures of Christ. And so Nestorius also almost made it seem as though Christ was two persons.
Yes, that was the fear, yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's kind of how it seemed. It's like the Logos attached himself to the person of the Messiah, and therefore you couldn't call Mary the mother of God. You have to say that she was the mother of Christ.
Right.
Christotokos.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so this was and I think in the Assyrian Church of the East, they still would refer to her as Christotokos, not Theotokos.
Correct.
Whereas the Mother of God, saying Mother of God, at least for the ancient Christians, Protestants will be confused by this, but at least for the ancient Christians, more or less was an affirmation of the divinity of Christ even within the womb. And so that's the brief little history for everyone who's totally confused and doesn't know what we're talking about. Is that all correct so far, Pradeep?
That's a great overview. Thank you. Yeah. I must have confused the heck out of everyone. So
well, no. I don't know who all. I mean, I think I have a lot of Orthodox listeners, so they probably would know what I'm talking about. But I'm sure there's also some people who would be totally confused. And so now you're saying in India, just to recap, that it was a relatively untouched community in the southwest that had mostly East Syriac rites.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
That was founded by Saint Thomas. But then throughout history, there was... So was it primarily a Church of the East then, from the very beginning?
Yes, at least from very early in the first millennium. So, there's some evidence that from the 5th century onward, some have it from the 7th century onward, they came into this relationship with the Church of the East, the Assyrian or Nestorian Church. And so that was basically the identity of the Christian community in India. Now, there's some dispute. There are some people who say, okay, there were always Oriental West Syriac Christians there, so they dispute that we were quote unquote Nestorian, and to what extent were we? But clearly, it was enough to motivate the Portuguese to burn everything and sort of bring everyone under the Latin rite, and kind of eliminate, or what's the word, cut off the relationship with the Church of the East. They cut that relationship off. So, were the Indian Christians just East Syriac right in India, or did they have some sort of indigenous flavor and difference in terms of how they worship? Was it a blend of these things? We're not really sure. There are some things here and there. I've heard that some of the Christian community practice polygamy, which is interesting, and that it was common for some of the Christians to go even and worship in the Hindu temples, which obviously would not be ideal. So I've heard those things, but again, there's no real clear picture of what we were like. So I can speak more to, what the church is like post, unity with the Patriarch of Antioch and how our music is, and talk about that.
Sure.
The East Syriac music is different. Like they're kind of, if you know one Syriac tradition and you come into encounter with the other one, you're like, oh, this is familiar in a lot of ways. It's almost like they're cousins. But even the way, like if you hear someone from the West Syriac tradition chanting in the Middle East versus someone from the East Syriac tradition, you even can hear the difference in the way they hold the vocal cords. It's different. Like they're different.
Interesting.
It's really fascinating. Yeah, very, very fascinating. But I don't know much about the East Syriac tradition musically or in their liturgics.
But just to say, so it was really the Portuguese who came and discovered, hey, there's Christians here.
Mm-hmm.
And those Christians who were somewhat loosely tied with the Nestorian Church of the East then said, hey, what are we gonna we gotta figure out something. And then the Catholic Church figured out a way to basically take their rights and convert a bunch of them into bring them into the Catholic Church. And that's one faction of Christianity currently in India. And there was a whole other group who said, what are we going to do? Let's find who we can attach ourselves to. And so most of them attach themselves to the Oriental Orthodox Church in Syria. So then what was East Syriac practice then became West Syriac practice for most of those Christians.
Yes.
And then there's still probably, is it the smallest group that are still tied with the Nestorian Church of the East?
They're a small group. Gosh, I wish I could give you an estimate. I think, so the Syro-Malabar, so that's the Eastern Rite Catholic Church, the East Syriac Rite Catholic Church, they are probably, I want to say 5 million, 5 to 6.
Okay.
I might be wrong about that. I believe by 5 to 6. The Oriental Orthodox, in both factions, we are probably 2 to 3 million together. And then you have, I'm not sure about the Latin Rite Catholics that are now in South India. And then, of course, I'm not talking about the rest of India. There's Latin Rite Catholics in North India, but in the South.
And everything we're talking about is mostly just Southwest, right? But that's
Southwest.
Also where the majority of the Christians are in India.
Yes.
Anyway.
So basically, if you're an Orthodox person from India, chances are you belong to a particular ethnic group called Malayali. We're Malayalis. We speak this language called Malayalam, which is the people of that region, of that state. There were at one time Christians from the state of Goa, which is north of us, which is a different ethnic group, different language. India is so complicated because it is, of course, as they call the subcontinent. Every state has a different language, 16 languages, thousands of different dialects. Different ethnic groups of people from the north where they're Indo-Aryan, to the south where they're Dravidian. So it's a whole different language group depending on what part of India you're from too. But yes, we're specifically talking about the Southwest, where St. Thomas is said to have landed, where the indigenous Christian community really developed and stayed and maintained. But there were at times people from other parts of India that became part of that community in Tamil Nadu. And now there's an effort to kind of do that again. There were some communities in Goa that we lost contact with through our own fault. They kind of fell away. They didn't fall away, but we kind of just lost contact with them. And then now there's an effort to kind of bring them back into the church. For example, and the Sri Lankan Christian. There were those indigenous Christians in Sri Lanka, but it just, for whatever reason, that kind of disappeared over time. So it's a really fascinating history, and one that's very messy and not very clear. But
Now, as far as music, sorry, I keep interrupting. I didn't mean to
no, you're
interrupt you.
fine. You're fine.
As far as music is concerned, I guess there would be really two big musical traditions then, right? That are both related, but or would you say
distinct,
there's
yeah.
more? Is there more than two? I mean, I guess there's variations,
Yeah.
right?
So
But two main, the East Syriac and the West Syriac.
correct. So that would be among the, you know, not including the Latin Rite Catholics there and the various Protestant groups that are there. That would be it. Yeah, West Syriac and East Syriac, and the East Syriac, other than that group that came under the Church of the East a little bit later, but the church that came under Rome and was allowed to keep some of the East Syriac Rite. As again, it's been Latinized, so it's a blend of Latin and East Syriac tradition. So I'm not knowledgeable about how their music is influenced by maybe some Latin Rite too. Definitely their liturgics. Um, their liturgical rites are very heavily Latinized, but their music I'm not sure. But the Oriental Orthodox churches in India, they maintain this West Syriac musical tradition pretty closely.
Okay, cool. So, just for thinking of trying to get a good musical, understanding of Christianity in India, then, like today, we'll mostly talk about West Syriac, and
Correct.
then, um, maybe I should talk to someone from the Syro Malabar. Is that what you said?
Yeah, Syro-Malabar Church, which is the East Syriac Rite Catholic Church. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
okay. And so that'd be interesting to kind of
And
compare
then
the two.
the the group that's directly under the Church of the East still is the Chaldean Syrian Church. I think I'm blanking, but the Chaldean Assyrian Church in India. But if you look up Assyrian Church, the East in India, I'm sure you'll the find the name. I don't know if I know anybody personally from that particular group. They're pretty
Hmm.
small. I don't know
Right.
if they have any churches in North America. I'm not certain, but Syro Malabar's definitely lots of churches in North America, and they're a larger
Interesting.
larger group than we are. So
Okay. So tell me, like, what are well, I guess maybe you should go through like some of the facets of Syriac chant then. Although, should I say Syrian chant rather than Syriac? What's the
yeah, thank you for bringing that up because I forgot to talk about that distinction. So again, historically, in English, sometimes we would refer to this culture and language and group of people as Syrian. Actually, only in like the 20th century, the Syriac Orthodox Church of Antioch said we're not going to call ourselves Syrian Orthodox because it has nothing to do with the country of Syria, but the language of Aramaic Syriac. And so they're
hmm,
the Syriac Orthodox Church, but before that they were calling themselves the Syrian Orthodox Church. And so the community in India, which was identified as Syrian Christian or properly Syriac Christian, but using that older expression Syrian, that's why you'll still see it today in India, because in India they didn't necessarily adopt Syriac, even though we probably should, so people aren't confused. But that's why, for example, the Orthodox Church that I belong to is the Malankara, referring to that region of India. Malankara Orthodox Syrian Church. They messed up the syntax. They should put Syrian in before Orthodox, but they did what they did. So it's Malankara Orthodox Syrian Church, which Syrian really means Syriac. And then the other jurisdiction in India, they'll call themselves sometimes the Malankara Syriac Orthodox or Syriac Orthodox Jacobite Church. They use that term Jacobite, which is actually a pejorative term. So even the Middle Eastern Church was like, please don't use that term, but they use it.
oh, really?
So yeah, Jacobite's a pejorative term that the Chalcedonians gave to us because it makes us sound like we're a church not founded by Christ, but founded by Jacob Bardeus or Bordono, by
Okay.
some like a rebellious figure.
Well,
Fascinating
there's
figure.
always
Everyone
the
thinks it's
thing
on.
of wanting to call yourself by the pejorative,
That's
you
true.
know,
Maybe it's this thing, a prideful thing.
like
Like, hey,
Christian,
yeah, that's right. That's right.
you know.
There you go. So, But you'll see again the Orthodox using this term Syriac or Syrian in South India. That's because of that heritage, that liturgical heritage that we inherited from the Syriac Church of the Middle East.
So if I said Malankaran Syriac, then that is the group that you're not part of, but that you are in communion with, that is also Oriental Orthodox.
Correct. Exactly. You wouldn't know the
Okay.
difference between us. We're exactly the same. Everything we do, liturgics, the rites, the vestments, the music, everything's the same, just governed by two different synods, and can't get along. Yes. So it's as as you've as you've gathered already, it's a very complicated community, the indigenous Christian community in India, and sadly, because we're so divided, um, and the church was kind of severed over and over again as different groups of Christians came from different parts of Europe and sort of, you know, converted people to one or the other denominations. So that's basically it, and that's why I wanted to start with kind of that overview as we talk about liturgical music. So this musical system, this West Syriac liturgical music system, you can imagine as it is brought by and taught by Christians from the Middle East to people from India. And the people from India have their own way of holding their vocal cords when they sing, right? Their own musical traditions. In the south, the classical music is called Carnatic music, as opposed to like the Hindustani music in the north. And so they're going to tell you, okay, sing it this way, which is how the music was taught in the church and still really is. It doesn't have uh, a developed form of notation like Western music does. So it was taught orally. So you learn liturgical music by rote. We have a master pupil system, what we call in Syriac a malfono, or in Kerala they say malpan. And basically he teaches you, okay, sing this. This is how we sing it, and then you just memorize it.
And how long does that take? Because, like, in the Georgian tradition, they would do the same thing, but it would take, like, I think it was like 8 years
That
of
sounds
basically
right.
full time study
That sounds
to
right.
become a
And
master chanter. And
and
it's
from what
like
I
in the
understand,
Greek, it's like 5 or something, but then it's similar, you know?
yeah, yeah. And the Ethiopian and Eritrean tradition, that's the case too. Like they spend years and years and years learning their liturgical music. Their music's beautiful, by the way. I know we had talked earlier about getting someone from their tradition on. Oh, amazing,
Yeah,
amazing.
eventually I want to talk to someone from the
Yeah,
Ethiopian
yeah.
tradition, but
I
it's
don't
been
know.
hard to find someone.
Yeah, yeah. So for me personally, like it took, gosh, and there's still a lot of hymns that I have to brush up on or that I don't remember or maybe I don't even know because the collection of liturgical music in the Syriac tradition, which we call the Beth Gazo, the treasure house or the treasury, um, at one point it was thousands of melodies, right? And so the masters just knew this off the top of their head. Because of persecutions in the Middle East, a lot of there were a lot of martyrs, including a lot of these musicians, a lot of the malfone, these masters, and so that, and because of over time, centuries and centuries, sometimes hymns are lost because they're more rare or they're not as frequently used, but also because of the persecutions and the loss of some of these masters in the Middle East. A lot of those hymns have sadly been forgotten. So what we have today, you have recordings of someone like that patriarch I had mentioned, Jacob III, who recorded up somewhere over 700, maybe 800 melodies that someone, and those are available, really terrible quality recordings by our standards today, but in the 20th century they recorded them, and those are the ones he remembered. And then there's other recordings of different malfone um, recording everything that they know, and so it's probably around 800 now. But you can imagine as this is being taught to Indians, how they will kind of make it their own. So when you hear a Syriac Christian from the Middle East chanting or singing, it's going to sound distinct, even though they're singing the same prayer and the same melody sometimes, than someone singing from India. So it's quite fascinating. So you have basically in the West Syriac musical tradition, you have what's now referred to as the Malankara school of West Syriac liturgical music, because we'll sing things a certain way. We might even modify the melodies slightly from time to time, um, to the point
It's
where
like
it's like,
90 95% the same?
Yeah, I would say 90 to 95% the same. And what complicates that is how diverse Syriac liturgical music is even in the Middle East. So in the Middle East, from region to region, you have different schools. So they'll be singing the same prayers, the same hymn, but they might sing it slightly differently. So the melody might be slightly different some places. Some places, so you have the main schools now are like the school of Turabdin, school of Mardin. Those are in modern day Turkey.
And then Edessa, right?
Edessa.
Is that the one in Aleppo, or is Aleppo different than Edessa?
So I believe Aleppo has its own thing, but now a lot of the school of Edessa adherents also are living in Aleppo and Lebanon and different places. So, and then the Iraqi school, Mosul or Tikrit, that school is kind of its own thing too. And so sometimes schools will sing things like very close to the same, sometimes be like, oh, that's pretty different. So it's really fascinating. And then you have the dissemination of that tradition to India, and then that becomes its own thing. So it's a very, very diverse tradition.
So it's like 5 or 6 traditions within like the broader Syriac world.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, the base of the system is the same. Like the way that we use 8 modes as the kind of the basis of our liturgical music tradition is essentially the same. But it's just kind of slight variations in how they might sing it. Sometimes, like the prayer books, so like our daily prayers for normal periods of the liturgical year outside of Great Lent, you'd call it probably ordinary time. What we call the shahimo, the common or simple daily prayers, or the prayers for the feast days and various other Sundays of the church. Those collections, sometimes like if you go from like a manuscript, handwritten, right, Syriac manuscript in Turabdin or Mardin area in Turkey, and then you compare it to the same book, like the Shahimo or the Fenkitho, the book of Sundays and feasts, in like Iraq, for example, like, oh, these are different hymns. Like, we know this hymn, but this isn't the hymn that we use for this day or that hour of prayer, that office of prayer. So there is a lot of variation. It's quite beautiful. It's very rich. So there's just so much music. And the way that it was learned, again, was using a device. Again, it's not notated. There are primitive notations sometimes you'll see in text, but they more indicate like this is the end of a musical phrase, this is the end of that stanza. Once in a while,
it's not like the Byzantine notation, which is much more. I mean, and then like Georgian has its own as well, but it's
correct.
Maybe I'm wrong on this. I'm supposed to talk to a Georgian chant expert soon, and he can correct me. But it doesn't seem as though they're what's it called? The marks. There's like a specific name for that. I'm forgetting.
Yeah.
I want to say diacritical marks, but it's not.
That's what was diacritical. Is that it? What I was thinking.
I'm not sure that's correct, but maybe.
Yeah. So other than that, and those are, I think, also fairly recent. Like you'll have a.
Yeah, it seems like Georgian isn't as sophisticated as the one and as the Byzantine. Like Byzantine, it seems like if you have a vague recollection of the melody, you could just sing the melody from it.
Yeah.
But the Georgian, it seems like it would be pretty hard to reconstruct unless you had a pretty solid grasp. So is it sort of maybe even like a step below that as far as like accuracy with regards to...
Exactly. So there's no real musical notation. So basically, like if you have a hymn in a service book in Syriac, and it'll say, okay, this is the form of it, and then this is the mode, right? This is the mode, and just gives you the words. So when you memorize it, you will use what we call a tufso, which is a loan word from Syriac into Greek, typos, a type. So you'll learn like the first sentence of this particular stanza is used to represent this melody, right? And so that's how you'll remember it. I'm forgetting the name, what that's called in English, this kind of device where you memorize unique set of words to represent a melody in your mind, and then I'm forgetting that too. But that's basically how it's taught. So this is a musical system like the Greek and like the Latin. It's based on 8 modes. And I know the Latin Church doesn't really use the 8 modes anymore, post Vatican II, maybe in certain places. I don't know if it's still maintained in the Anglican rite in various places, but
I mean, not really. What's interesting, I don't know if you know this, but Thomas Tallis came up with his own octoecho system.
really,
Yeah, you can sing. You actually could set stuff into Thomas Tallis mode 3. You know.
that's phenomenal. That is phenomenal. I'm gonna
And
have
so
to
I
tell my
don't.
brother.
Yeah.
My brother is it has a choral music background, and he loves Talis. So I don't know if he was aware of that. So I'm gonna have to tell him that. He's probably gonna look that up.
Yeah.
Um,
But with
is
these
he?
various Syriac traditions, sorry to jump back.
No
Like
worries.
in Georgia, there's like it depends on the monastery, and the
Mhm.
music is almost kind of radically different. I mean, it's still Georgian, but like the Galati monastery is like way different than like I'm gonna butcher the pronunciation like Shemok Medi. Like
Mhm.
and one will be super wild, and then the other one not as wild. But it's hard to even say they're the same melody. Like they're really different melodies. Is the difference between like a Desan chant versus that found in Turkey versus that found in Malankara, or is it that different or it's not as varied?
I would say largely you can identify it. Like you'd be like, okay, this is what they're. I can kind of recognize what they're singing. But sometimes there is that very stark contrast and very different wave. So I think, I if we ever, God willing, if you get to interview someone from the Syriac Church like Gabriel Aydin, uh, who's a
Yeah,
proper
we're supposed to
musician,
do one
unlike
soon.
myself. Yeah, he's a proper musician, unlike myself, and like in the way that you are a proper musician as well. So he can speak to it more, and he has a much wider knowledge of how it may differ from school to school because he studied all that really in depth. I've heard sometimes like a priest had showed me this is how they sing it in um, Toradin school, and this is how we inherited in India according to a more Tikrit style or Mosul style, and they sounded completely different for the same hymn. So that does happen, but I would probably say from what it sounds like, maybe less frequently than it does in the Georgian tradition. You can kind of more or less say, okay, well, it's just some variation here and there with the melody, but more or less it's similar. And
I
it does, though, kind of follow where the big monastic communities were, as
Okay.
far as the where the schools are based or these primary um, traditions kind of developed. And there's obviously smaller communities and smaller traditions that maybe are extinct now or not very well known, but the primary ones that still exist are kind of based around those monastic communities for sure.
I think maybe some of it has to do with how heavy-handed the higher ups in the hierarchy are about the chant traditions.
Yeah, I
Because there were supposedly hundreds and hundreds of Western church like chant
oh yeah,
traditions.
Ambrosian and Celtic and Masoretic and all these things. I think the
Right. And
Syriac
you
Church.
can still there's still like I think Ambrosian you can still hear in Milan. Um
I think so. Yeah, I think that's what I had heard.
and
Yeah.
Mozarabic, I think there's places in Spain that
Yes.
still do it. But for the most part it was this top-down imposition which said
Eventually, everything
everybody's got
was
to do Gregorian,
Latinized.
which
Yeah.
in a way was great. Like we wouldn't have Western music notation if it wasn't for that.
Hmm.
So it's just trade-offs, you know.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
lost all these different chant traditions because of that. But then
Yeah.
we also
The
gained the ability to, expand
yeah.
music because of it as well. So it's,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, for sure. I think the Syriac tradition was more tolerant of its diversity. You even have very early saints and scholars like Dionysius Barsalibi, who said, all the diversity within the church, and he was just talking about the Syriac tradition, gives greater glory to God because everyone is praising God in their own um, through their own, I forget the exact quote, but basically through their own language and cultural lens and through their own unique background, and so that those things give glory to God because ultimately it's the same prayers that we're singing and the same faith. It's just expressed with different ornamentation, and so that would give so that sentiment you can see really in the Syriac tradition from early on, and so there was no attempt that I know of, to kind of standardize things. It happens from time to time. In India, what happened was teachers from different parts of the Middle East came to India at various points, and so in the state of Kerala, sometimes in the south of that state, they might sing. They might have learned according to a different school than those in the north historically, and so there's some difference in the way that they chant that you can hear even today. I'm not as familiar with that because I didn't grow up there, but you know, people still tell me the patriarch who spent time in India and taught some of the priests and now bishops of the church, that some of them are still around today in the 20th century. Yaqub III was from the Mosul tradition, but when he recorded those melodies, he was trying to sing according to the Mardin tradition, which is, I guess, more widespread. And if you talk to some of the Syriac Orthodox musicians, they'll be like, yeah, he kind of did his own thing. He didn't quite get it right. So he's kind of his own kind of unique school by himself, and he influenced a lot of what's happening in India today, because we have teachers from him, people that learned from him that only passed away like within the last 10-20 years. So they maybe it's longer than that, 20-30 years. So they influenced a lot of the bishops and priests who are teaching music today. So that drift will probably continue to happen. And because these things aren't notated, are we singing the exact melody that Saint Ephrem intended for this melody he wrote in the 300s, right? Like, probably not, because it wasn't written down. Maybe there's some characteristics that have been preserved, but it's impossible to know.
Well, I mean, it is surprising how much like an oral tradition can maintain its integrity. I mean, when you have communities going through inquisitions and then you're trying to revive stuff, it gets complicated. But if you have relative peace, it can be relatively accurate. I mean, the Coptics at least say that their music comes from pharaonic times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, their burial hymn that they sing on Good Friday, they say this is a pharaonic melody, and that would be fascinating. Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't have a reason not to believe them. There's no way of knowing, but
one of my favorite teachers as a kid in high school said, talking about the integrity of oral tradition, that we shouldn't easily dismiss it right out of hand, used the example of troubadours in medieval Europe. And they would go and sing the news for 30 minutes, right? The news of the day in song form for 30 minutes to a group of peasants hearing it for the first time. And after hearing a 30-minute song for the first time, these uneducated, right, illiterate, presumably peasants, could repeat it word for word, because they had to use their capacity for memorization much differently than we do today. Everything's written down, everything's recorded. Our capacity for remembering things is not tested in the way that was essential for previous generations, right? Even in the Middle East, sing for 30 minutes, okay, sing what I just sang back to you. And they could. It's amazing. So I think you're spot on that, we can't easily dismiss oral tradition.
There's this black gospel anthem thing that I taught my choir for this missions conference thing. Sing till the power of the Lord come down, and by Keith Hampton. Great anthem. And at the time my dad was playing at a black church, and I had him bring his drummer and he's a bass player, and his organist. And his organist plays the B3, does not read a lick of music. And so this piece has a relatively complicated structure. I mean, it's not just like a 7-Eleven song where it's like 7 words repeated 11 times with like 4 chords. I mean, this is a relatively complicated piece of music. And I spent 2 or 3 weeks rehearsing it with the choir. He heard it one time and immediately had it on the organ. Didn't need to write anything down, didn't need to diagram it, knew every single chord, knew exactly where the bridge was. I'm like, it still sort of exists, this sort of immediate memory.
Yeah. We have that capacity, we just don't use it because we're the tech the tech generations with our smartphones and everything like that, and recordings, and so that's made it much easier. Going back to liturgical music and how to learn it, when I went to seminary, I'm spoiled because someone gave me let's see, what was it like a folder of MP3s or like like a USB drive, like this priest singing all these forms that major forms that we need to know, and so that's probably how a lot of people learn it now today, including a lot of people who don't go to study at seminary, but they love liturgical music. It's like, oh, give me those recordings of this and that priest, and they'll start to learn it. In addition to how they learn it at the church, right? They'll just growing up in the church, you'll start to learn some of these hymns. But that's basically, yeah, I guess taught by rote. And I guess I could talk about the characteristics of kind of Syriac music and liturgical music and what makes it unique.
And just to be clear, when you said you learned it at seminary, this is St. Vlad's?
I went to St. Vladimir's, Orthodox Seminary in New York.
Which they're Eastern Orthodox,
yes.
Not in communion, right?
Correct. So, but they're very welcoming to Oriental Orthodox students who come and study there. And so rather than go study in India, a lot of us would choose to study at one of the Orthodox seminaries in the United States, primarily one of the two major OCA, Orthodox Church in America seminaries that are of Russian background. So St. Vladimir's in New York or St. Tikhon's in Pennsylvania. And so we have a large enough community of like Indian Orthodox, right, seminarians that we have like our own chapels. And so we learn how to do our daily prayers and learn our rites and rubrics according to our traditions. So that's kind of how I learned. But in India, again, they will have this, you'll go to class and you'll have this master, this malpan or malfono, teach you, okay, these are the melodies for this hymn and that form and so forth. So it's still basically taught that way, just master to student for the most part, with the exception of sometimes you just have a bunch of recordings and you're just trying to digest them and memorize them. So that's how I learned. And obviously growing up in the church, you know stuff just from going to church too, but formally learning it. And I just fell in love with the liturgical music. It has such beauty, and as I'll kind of talk about, it's very simple at the same time, and there's a reason for that. So West Syriac liturgical music is a Semitic music, because that culture and language is Semitic. And the music is monophonic, and it's intentional. There are no harmonies, because the focus is supposed to be on the word and the unity of voices. Congregational singing is really the standard, even though now, like in the churches in the Middle East, sometimes the deacons will do a lot of the singing. But still, it's still heavily, the congregation will sing hymns and the responses. And in India, it's all congregation. I mean, the deacon might have an exhortation, or the priest, right, will say a prayer, that the people all respond together, the people all sing hymns. So at the average church, at least in India, you wouldn't see like a choir leading it, because it's just, someone will be up there and will lead the first line of the hymn, and then the people will respond. So they're expected to know it.
Wow. So it's I guess the most congregational of the Orthodox music.
I would say. I know other traditions, like in the Byzantine Orthodox or the Eastern Orthodox world, what they call the cathedral rite or the cathedral style was more congregational, but that's kind of fallen out of use. I think there's a monastery or two in the northeast of the country that I try to use that, if I remember correctly. But yeah, it kind of became more of the job of the choir, right, and cantors to kind of lead everything. But in India, it's very, very, congregational. Now, in the West Syriac music, it is antiphonal. So, in churches in the Middle East, for example, you'll have like two groups of like deacons, and you call them a choir, to gude or gudo, for a choir, and they will kind of lead the hymns back and forth. This group will sing one stanza, and then the group on the other side will sing the other stanza, and back and forth. In India, that really manifests itself as the men and the women. So the men will sing one stanza of a hymn, and then the women will sing. It doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes it's just like one side of the church versus the other side of the church. But that happens a lot too, where it's just the men and the women and the men and the women. And that is to promote
on different sides of the church, right?
Different sides of the church.
Y'all still maintain that?
Yeah. So in India, some of the parishes in North America don't do that. Most of them do. Some don't, but yeah, traditionally it was the men and the women on different sides. And so that's how the antiphonal music is done in Indian context. I think in the Middle East sometimes you'll hear it that way too. And Saint Ephrem, one of the most influential hymnographers in the Syriac tradition, when he introduced his hymns into the church, he used female choirs. And so even today, you don't see this in India, but in the Middle East, you still see ordained cantors, female cantors who are organized as a choir and will lead the hymns, and they wear stoles, and they're not the same office as deaconess. It would be kind of a minor order cantor.
And
but that
Syriac
tradition is still
did have
maintained.
deaconesses as well, but not anymore.
They did, yeah. Not anymore, but they still maintain those cantors, those female cantors. And so you'll see maybe a choir more often in a Middle Eastern context, of a female choir, but still it's basically congregational where the deacons are leading and so forth. In India now, sometimes you'll see churches have like a choir of like 3 or 4 people on a microphone or something like that leading, but they don't need to be there because unless you're doing a service where people aren't familiar with the hymns, something like that. But traditionally they weren't there in the Indian context. It was just, if the priest was there, if the priest led the hymn, the people would follow, or one of the deacons or servers on the altar would lead the hymn, and then people would follow. They'd know the hymn. So that's how it's done. Traditionally, we don't have instrumentation. The Syriac music didn't have instruments, although there's an interesting allowance by a figure, a great scholar in Syriac tradition from the 13th century, Bar Ebroio, or Bar Hebros, they refer to him in Latin. And he said, don't use instruments in worship, but if you're going to use a little organ like the Latins do, it's okay as long as it's like very subtle and subdued. So there's an allowance for it, at least from him.
When was that?
13th century.
13th century.
Yeah.
Oh man, you got to find me that quote.
I have to remember where I found it, but it was really interesting. But
because there's a big argument, people will, claim up and down that organs were not used to accompany singing in the West until at least the 1400s.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, this was 13th century.
That would seem to indicate the opposite.
Yeah.
And there's, of course, another school of thought that's like, well, no, of course they did. It's just they were small portative organs, and they weren't the big organs used like they were later, because there were other things that were used, like the serpent. Do you know about this? Like in France, there's like this really, really weird instrument called like the serpent. I think it's called the serpent, or the serapion, is it? I think it's called a serpent. Yeah, it's and so because it's weird symbolism there, and it's like a reed instrument, but it was used during processions to lead the Gregorian chant singing.
Oh, interesting. Oh, that's fascinating. I had not heard about that.
And it's like only a French thing. It's and every now and then you'll see it in French churches, but not really anymore. It's mostly organ. But up through the 1800s, they were still using the serpent.
Interesting.
So I'm of the opinion that the organ was probably used in the West from like 1100.
That was my understanding. I thought
maybe even earlier, but like some proto, primitive organ, because there was an organ sent from the Byzantine emperor. It was actually sent from Byzantium to the West. I believe to the Pope, or either to an emperor or to a pope. To King Pippin, I believe, from the Byzantine emperor in the 500s.
Okay, interesting. That's early, yeah.
Yeah. So, but the thought was it was probably just used either for processionals outside of the church or something like that. Anyway, not to get off on a tangent.
No,
but that's super
really
interesting.
Yeah.
And I love that quote.
So Gregorios Bar Hebros, or Bar Ebroio, is the one who made that allowance, but really it wasn't used. So I don't think that was widely adopted as anything really. There was no instruments. In the 20th century, following the persecutions, like the Armenian genocide, what the Syriacs called the Year of the Sword, Saiful, when so many people were martyred by the Ottoman Turks, that included a lot of these musical masters. And so the synod, shortly after that, I think in the 20s, maybe 30s, I might be misremembering, I think under Ignatius Elias, the patriarch, the synod had said, you are allowed to use some organ right in the liturgy, but the from what I understand, the reasoning behind that was because they lost so many of these musical masters, they thought that using instruments would help preserve some of these melodies and make it easier to teach them. So, but otherwise, really, the tradition is no instrumentation, other
And did they
than
do that in the Malankaran Syrian
yeah. So
tradition?
now you have, but I think so I can't speak to the Middle Eastern churches, but in India, I think from about the 70s, 80s onward,
Mm-hmm.
I think they really took this and ran. So you start to see heavy use, especially in India, of keyboards, and not always in great taste, if I may so say so myself. I apologize if I offend anybody, but um, it's like these Casio keyboards basically, and they will use synthesized beats even, right, and other synthesized instrumentation. And to me, it sounds like we're in a video game from the '80s, and I love video games from the '80s and '90s, right? I'm born in the '80s. I love those things, but not in liturgical worship. I just think it sounds awful. But
I
and
would
there's a
tend to
lot of
agree with you. I,
there's a
I
lot
love
of
the organ, but
yeah, I love the organ and the way that it's done in the Western Christian tradition. It sounds beautiful, but it's interesting too putting a Western instrument into Oriental music because I can hear a lot of discordance, right? When you're on a microtone or um, and the keyboard is doing semitones and can't match it, and it drives me nuts just from that perspective. Let alone it's like I think it's become too much of a performance based thing, and again, it really just sounds awful. I think personally, and changes kind of the character of our traditional liturgical music. But aside from that, just the discordance, I'm like, oh, please stop. But the only instruments that we traditionally do have, if you call them instruments, is we use bells to signify important moments during the liturgy, like epiclesis, things like that, institution. Um, and along with, like in India, they use handbells, but they also use, which in the Middle Eastern churches they use, is a fan. Like the Byzantines have fans, but our fans have bells on them, and so you ring them. They're attached to a uh, long staff, and these actually I have a toy one I can show you that I made for my son. My son likes to sometimes do pretend worship. So this is not what they look like, but this is a toy that I made. But basically, they have the image of angels of seraphim on them, and then they'll have bells on them, and so when you ring them like that. So for certain moments in the liturgy, or like when we read the gospel, when we process to the lectern to read the gospel, we'll ring those bells. So that's a kind of instrumentation, you could say, but it's not done in any rhythmic manner. It's
not like
just
the
sort of to
Coptics
highlight.
with the
Exactly, not like
cymbals. Yeah.
exactly, yeah. So it's not tied to the music. It's just to highlight these important moments during the liturgical services. But otherwise, yeah, traditionally no music. Again, monophonic, no harmonies. The emphasis is on unison, that everyone's singing the same melody as one voice, the one body singing together, the one body of Christ.
Quick
And so
question.
now,
You said
mhm,
microtonal,
mhm.
and in the book that I was reading, it seemed to indicate that microtonality was more of an East Syriac tradition than West Syriac. But I do know from Gabriel's book that in the different modes there are microtones in like the eight
Yeah,
modes, and
yes.
so is there microtones in, or is it all, you know,
So,
Western tuning?
so yes, so the Syriac tradition does have those, but I think in India we're not as precise about it, and um, so maybe they will become semitones. um, so that's probably why that book was talking about it in that way. And as you were talking about this book, where there have been recent attempts to kind of notate Syriac liturgical music according to Western notation. And so that particular book by that Indian priest, I think doesn't attempt to make any distinction. He's just using straight Western notation, whereas the book by Gabriel Aydin has those indications marks to indicate microtones and things like that. So I think you can get by without without worrying about microtones too much in the Indian style. Um, but I think it does show up more. And I'm not too familiar with the East Syriac tradition, but that would make sense that it's more emphasized in that tradition
Hmm.
than in the West Syriac. But um, otherwise, the melodies, they tend to be very simple as well. You do have hymns and things that are are somewhat complex, but overall they're pretty easy to learn as someone who grows up in the church because they're designed to be more simple and more accessible to the common worshiper. I think because of that emphasis on congregational singing. So the Syriac liturgical tradition is really hyper focused on this kind of like accessibility and simple approach so that everyone can participate as one. Even the Shagimo, the book of the daily prayers, the canonical daily prayers of the hours, the 7 times of prayer. There are some of the early Syriac fathers will say the melodies are simple so that it can be prayed by the monk and the common worshiper alike, meaning the layperson, or right, the person at the average parish community can sing it. So the emphasis really is on that and the unity and the unison of worship in the Syriac tradition. It was really funny because I mentioned it's Semitic music. I remember reading some work by a scholar talking about Syriac liturgical music, and he said, as a member of the Semitic family of music, it's loud and monophonic. And I don't know why loud was a description, but it was really funny. But interestingly, we had some people from Jewish backgrounds hear our music. We had, I think, a couple people who had converted to Orthodoxy at my home parish, and they had talked about how this music makes them think of their music they grew up with, the Jewish music they grew up hearing in the synagogues, and more so when they hear Middle Easterners singing Syriac music as opposed to the way Indians sing it. Like, oh, this sounds just like what I heard growing up. So it's a really fascinating connection too to Semitic Christianity, and presumably before, these hymns and this music was sort of developed, up in the very early part of the first millennium, they would presumably be singing some of the Jewish hymns and chants that they had inherited.
Well, it seemed like a lot of this, like that type of Christianity, was heavily Semitic at the beginning, and just from reading, the whole like antiphonal thing is totally Semitic and totally in the Psalms. The whole like if you ever read Robert Alter's, do you know Robert Alter, the author? He wrote The Art of Biblical Narrative, and he also wrote The Art of Biblical Poetry. He's a Jewish scholar, and his Old Testament is amazing. It's like he translated the entire, Old Testament, and it's remarkable. But in The Art of Biblical Poetry, it's like going through the Psalms, and he talks about like basically what every psalm verse does. It's like there's normally a dyadic structure on almost every verse of almost every psalm, and then it either explains the first half of the verse and the second half. So like take verse 1, A, B. B usually explains A, or it intensifies A.
That's
or there's like one other, and now I forget, but it's generally like intensification or explanation is what it always does.
Yes, and the Syriac music still does that in many places. So, for example, you'll say like Psalm 51 in the morning prayer, and then the hymn following it used to be interspersed with the verses of Psalm 51. Like you sing Psalm 51, and then you sing this stanza, then the next verse of Psalm 50 or 51, depending on which Old Testament you have, and then this hymn, which we call a responsorial or eniono. And so that is still there, where it's supposed to kind of reflect on what you just sang, like the psalm. So we still have those. I forget what they call that in Greek too.
Yeah, because they do that on Holy Saturday with Psalm
and
119.
Psalm and hymn. Yeah.
And it takes like an hour because it's the longest psalm, and they do a hymn between every verse. But even within the psalm itself, Psalm 51 is perfect, because it's, "Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy steadfast love. According to the abundance of thy mercy, blot out my transgressions." It's saying the same thing, just in more flowery language.
Yes. You see that all over the Syriac hymnody, where it's like, we adore and worship and honor and venerate you in the same sentence, because it's like, well, those are all synonymous, but it's that, again, that Semitic repetition to highlight something or to speak of its importance. That is very, very prevalent in the hymns and the prayers. One of the cool things about Syriac liturgical music is it has a very discernible metrical structure. There are some chants which are kind of unmetered and kind of free, and there's some chants that are sort of improvisational, but the hymns generally are metered. So Saint Ephrem, the Syrian, one of the most influential hymnographers in the Syriac tradition, he had different meters, but one of them that he made famous and wrote a lot in is in couplets of 7. So you'll see that a lot in our churches today. So you'll have, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then those 2 lines will repeat again. And so it makes it really easy, for example, when you're translating from Syriac into English, and you're trying to arrange the English translations to these hymns, to this meter. You're just like, oh, I just need to fit that meaning in 7 syllables and I'm good to go. So you'll have that. So you have a lot of meter where it's like 7-7, or another form that's like 12-12, 9-9, 12-12.
Does it rhyme as well?
It does not. Although
Okay.
translations into English that were done in India in the 20th century did emphasize rhyming, but it's not there in the Syriac. And then the more contemporary translations we have in English don't focus on that, mostly because we had a hard enough time, wanting to be accurate to the Syriac and also have some decent musical phrasing without also being constrained by, we've got to rhyme it too. So we chose not to, those of us that do some of that work in English. But Indians had tried to do that into English with the Malayalam, right? The vernacular that is used in South India. They translated from Syriac into Malayalam only in the 20th century. Before that, all the liturgical services were in Syriac. And then they decided to use the vernacular, Malayalam. And
could they understand it? Like in India?
Most of the people know. So it was like as if people were using Latin today in the Roman Catholic Church. Most people would not. A lot of the clergy would. Most of the clergy would, but the average person wouldn't know. Sometimes after a while they started responding in Malayalam, in the vernacular. But basically it was mostly Syriac. But then in the 20th century they translated everything, or all the main things that they needed, into Malayalam, because not everything still is translated from Syriac. But most of it that we need, I should say.
Because that would seem to work against the whole being super congregational if nobody knows the language.
Correct. But somehow I guess they just...
So like, did they learn the hymns and just not know what they were saying?
I think that was probably the case a lot of the time. So, but I could be wrong about that. Maybe people understood it more than I'm giving them credit for.
Well, because I guess if you're Latin Rite Catholic, you get to the point where Pater Noster, quiescent,
Yes,
you just kind of know what you're saying.
And another thing in the Syriac prayers and hymns that goes back to what we were talking about earlier about the simplicity and the approachability and accessibility is even, the hymns in Syriac, they're beautifully profound and rich in symbolism, but grammatically, it's not very high register. Whereas if you read Syriac patristics and things like that, it'll be sometimes much more difficult to understand or to translate depending on your level. Like, I couldn't begin to translate or understand if I was reading patristics in Syriac, but some of the hymns of the church, like, oh yeah, I can translate it because it's relatively simple. Because again, it was this idea we wanted to be understood and people would participate. So this thread goes throughout the Syriac tradition of this accessibility, and it's beautiful in that way. And then so we have the metrical structure, and then, like I said, it's based on 8 modes, or sometimes we call it 8 tones, which the Byzantine Orthodox tradition has, and the Latin Church had too. System of 8 modes. So depending on the year or the feast day, we'll attach certain modes, and these are very simple. Sometimes they're only like 3 or 4 notes, maybe 5 in a given mode. So 1 through 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But what the Syriac fathers did with just these few notes in each mode is astounding. The priest that wrote the book you're referring to, Father M.P. George, had said what the fathers did with each mode, with these just simple few notes, is magic. There's so many beautiful melodies in each tone, in each mode, just using these variations of these notes. So different modes have different associations with different feast days or different theological ideas. So, for example, tone 1 is like incarnational themes. So we use tone 1 in Christmas at the Nativity. We use tone also at the Resurrection because that's part of the incarnational activity and the work
What
of
does tone
salvation.
1 sound like?
So, like I was singing one in the meter of St. Ephraim's supplicatory hymns. So I think I used one there. So, Lord, have mercy upon us. Oh, Lord, receive our service. In another hymn in the same tone, blessed are the good servants whom when their Lord comes, he finds watchful and working in his great vineyard, girding himself, he will serve all those, etc., etc. And so those will be for that day. The second tone is the baptism of Christ. So at Theophany or Epiphany, however you refer to it, and also at baptisms of people will be 2, for example. 8, the tone 8 is associated with the cross and martyrs and so forth, and the departed. So these tones, so the liturgical music is arranged according to these tones. Okay, this theme or this particular liturgical service, we set it primarily to this mode. So they're a little simpler than maybe Western modes as far as the number of notes in the scale that they'll use, in the mode they'll use. But that's basically how it's arranged. You do have some hymns that only have one melody, that are always done the same melody. And then you also have sometimes a hymn will have more than 8. It'll have sometimes 9 because we have what we call a basic mode. And then you'll have special melodies for its different times of year, like a Lenten version of this hymn, or a Holy Week version of this hymn, or a Palm Sunday version of this hymn. That's only done during that time. And so some hymns will have like 12, 13 ways of singing it. So it's very, very rich. And depending on the Sunday, so like the Sunday after Easter is a cycle, kind of a mini cycle of the liturgical year. So those are divided into 8 weeks, basically. So the Sunday after Easter will start a liturgical cycle. So that Sunday, which we call New Sunday, the Sunday after the resurrection starts tone 1, and the next week is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then it resets 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, unless there's a major feast, and some feasts throughout the year will reset the tone. But otherwise, it's like that. So if you start at the Church New Year, which for us is in late October, early November, depending on the calendar, it'll start at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then Nativity falls right after that. So that's 1. Any day of the week, the Sunday after that's 1, and then it starts like that. So, and then
So
each
like
tone,
with the like with the Russians, the modes sort of change depending on
yes, depending on the
what
kind
you're-
of year,
yeah.
and then from week to week, that each tone has a complement. So 1 is paired with 5, 2 with 6, 3 with 7, 4 with 8, and so throughout the week you alternate between those complementary tones, 1 and 5. So Sunday is 1, Monday is 5, Tuesday is back to 1, and so forth. And the reason that
because I
they
know
have
it's
those,
like they say there's 8, but it's sort of like there's 50. Because I don't know, at least in the like in the OCA, there's like the Stachera tone and the Kontakion tone,
Yes.
and then and then the Lord I Call tone, and then
Yes.
all of those tones are different in Lent, and all those tones are different in
Yeah.
Easter, and all those
Yeah.
tones are different in Christmas, and all those tones are different in Advent,
Yep.
and it's like
Yep.
okay, so it's like not really 8 tones.
Yeah, it's like, yeah,
8
exactly. So
tones.
eight modes, and then a bunch of different kinds of hymns that are written using that modality, but they're numerous. So like a form would be like St. Ephraim's supplicatory hymns, a Botho of St. Ephrem, a supplicatory hymn of St. Ephrem. You sing that 8 ways, but then you also have in tone 1 or whatever, you have that in tone 1. Then you have the other thing that I sang, which is called Kukoyo, that form, and you can sing that. That's totally different structure. It's like a AA, BB, AAB, whereas the Ephraim is whatever, AB, AB. And you have other forms. You have, countless forms. So like if you read a service book, a hymnal book, it'll say, this is the form. And then based on that form, okay, this is how tone 1 sounds for this particular form, this particular set of syllables and words and structure. Or it's this different melody. So it's a both of Saint Jacob of Saruk, not Saint Ephraim. So that's written in 12s. So okay, now I know the 8 tones for that. So you have, it's not just like 8 melodies you have to learn. You're exactly right. It's like hundreds and hundreds of melodies. So it's so rich, and there's so much variation between melodically, but also rhythmically too. A lot of, again, going back to the Semitic heritage, a lot of this music is pretty driving, but not all of it. So like that example I gave of Ephraim's supplicatory hymn in the first tone, Lord have mercy upon us, O Lord receive our service. Da, 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 da. But then you also have in tone 8, Lord have mercy upon us, O Lord receive our service. La 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 la. So the rhythm is very interesting, to the point where some of these tones, if you tried to put them in a time signature, you just absolutely couldn't. There'd be so many, accidentals and changes of time signatures. It's really interesting. There's another form, the Malkuth Raumo, the kingdom on high. In tone 8 would be la 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 la. So rhythmically very interesting and diverse among those different 8 tones and among all those hundreds of melodies that you find like within each tone, within each mode.
Sounds like you could do the Coptic symbols to it.
You could.
I mean, I know you don't have that,
to it. Yeah,
but
yeah. And some of it's more driving and fast, but then you have there's a hymn from our funeral service, for example, which is more slow. La 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 do 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 la la la. It's very, so there's a lot of variation with rhythm and melody and tempo and things like that. Very diverse. I remember a deacon that we knew growing up from Iraq was talking to about us one time, and he said it's just such a profound, beautiful part of the Syriac tradition is how varied the music is, how rich it is. And so hopefully that gives folks a decent idea of kind of how the music is structured.
O Lord, absolve your clergy. Hallelujah. The priests and deacons who served in their lifetime at your altar in monasteries and churches, they carried in their hands your body and blood for the pardon of their offenses. O Lord, by your body, absolve their debts, and by your blood, Lord, forgive their sins. May they cry at your right hand, glory to you, Lord. Barak you, Lord. Menu